Hi everyone, my name is Bill Kennedy. This is Go Miami. Tonight we have some really special guests. We've got Mark Bates all the way from Boston on this video, and then we'll have a second video later with Richard Bucker on it. Did I say that right, Bucker? And they're going to have some really great talks for us tonight. So before we start, I want to thank SendGrid for sponsoring us as they do every month. So all the pizza and the drinks. Also want to really thank Venture Hive for giving us a place to meet every month. And now I'm going to turn this over to Mark. So Mark, are you there?
I'm here, Bill.
Awesome. So I'm going to mute our stuff here. So please tell everybody about yourself, and then
I assume you've muted yourself. I just want to first lodge a complaint that no one sent a pizza to my house. So I think you guys need to rectify that in the future. Anyway, I am Mark Bates. I am at Mark Bates on the Twitters, the GitHubs, all that nice stuff. You might remember me from such books as Distributed Programming with Ruby, Programming in CoffeeScript, and Conquering the Command Line. You're also just as likely to never have heard of me before. That's totally cool. I'm based in Boston, as Bill said. I'm a consultant. I do a lot of Go work. I also run the weekly screencast series, Metacast.tv, where I cover all things Go. So, for example, this week's was WebSockets Part 2. So we do some really fun stuff every week, and totally recommend you check it out. But we're not here to hear me shill my products. You can do that just by following me online. We're actually here to talk about Go web applications. Before I get into that, though, I want to tell you a very quick story. And as Bill will attest, my quick stories tend to be a really, really long time. But I'm going to keep this one short. And at no point during this story do I not have my pants on and no one gets deported. So, real quick story. I started my career back in the late 90s. Well, actually, that's not true. I guess I said no one gets deported. I got deported, which is actually how the whole story starts. So I got deported from England. I was living there. I got deported. They wouldn't let me stay. I got sent back to Boston. I needed a job. It was 1999, and if you could spell HTML, you got like $30,000 a year. So as someone with a music degree, being able to spell HTML was pretty awesome. I got that $30,000. I actually got a bonus of $5,000 because I knew what it stood for, which is pretty cool. So I started doing UI development, so it's basically just HTML, lots of font tags, tables, nested in tables, and so on. And eventually got into Java. Did Java programming until about 2004. At which point I basically threw my hands up in the air and said, enough, I can't do this anymore. This is terrible. Life is too short to be a Java developer. And so I quit, and I went and tried to become a recording engineer at a studio in Boston. And one thing I will tell you about that is if you're looking for a way to never make money but work incredibly long hours, recording engineering might be the profession for you. And I did this for like 2 years, and I've got some really great stories out of that. And next time I'm in Miami, somebody can buy me a watermelon mojito, and I'll be more than happy to tell you all about the antics of the musicians that came through there. And trust me, there's some good stories. But anyway, during this time, I did a few contracts here and there. But in October of 2005, I was out drinking with a former colleague of mine. And as we were wont to do, we were talking about technology, and he said to me, "Have you heard of Ruby?" And I was like the precious gem, precious gem. And he was like, "No, the programming language. Like, never heard of it before in my life." It's like, "You got to check this thing out." I said, "Man, I am out. I am like Al Pacino here. I am pulling myself out." And he was like, "No, you got to check out this Rails thing, man. It's kind of cool." I was like, "Dude," he's like, just try it out." So I went home, I installed it, I built a small little application for my family for that Christmas for our website, for like a Christmas wish list thing. And the feeling I got immediately upon using it was just that of clicking my heels up in the air. Like, I actually think I did go running into the street, clicking my heels up in the air. But again, I was probably very, very drunk when I did it. But I digress. It was amazing. It was just this like phenomenal, refreshing way to write code. You know, with Java, I was working in Java apps that had 100,000 lines of configuration in XML. That's not Java code. That's just XML configuration, 100,000 lines. And now here was this thing that embraced convention over configuration. It kind of took care of everything for me. I just had to focus on my business logic. It was remarkable. It was this breath of fresh air. Now, however, when I sit down to work on a Rails app, I feel a bit more like George Costanza. I've got my pants around my ankles. I'm, upset, crying into the floor. No one's hiring me as their latex salesman. It's a sad life for me whenever I have to sit there and work. But I guess, so by the way, I also promised you no pants would be down during this talk, and I guess I lied there. So both deportation and no pants during my talks. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Anyway, so in October of 2013, I spent a month in Istanbul one weekend, as Bill likes to hear me describe it, with Blake Mizorani and Andrew Guerin from the Go team. And they are two of the biggest Gopher evangelists you will ever meet in your life. Now, I had already kind of taken to Go a little bit. I played with it. I think even did a Metacast episode. And we were at this conference, and I even almost changed the nature of my talk to be about Go, but I obviously didn't. And I'm glad I didn't, because these two totally blew us away with their talk. And so over the 3 or 4 days we were in Istanbul, they basically converted me. I walked out of there kind of shaking my butt, screaming hallelujah, praising Jeebus. I was in. I drank the Go Kool-Aid. And I remember having breakfast with the two of them one day, and I said to them, hey, what's the Rails for Go? Right? And this is a pretty straightforward question, at least I thought at the time, right? One of the things you will say about Rails is that it kind of changed the landscape of how web application development is done. Every language now has a Rails, right? There's a Rails for Clojure, there's a Rails for PHP, there's a Rails for Java. Every language has a Rails. So my question was, what is the Rails for Go? How do I build these web apps? What do I use? Their reaction, however, was a bit more like this. Just stunned, shocked, what? And now, I'll be honest, I get asked this question all the time, because I go and I preach the gospel of Go to my fellow Rubyists and other people I meet along the streets, on dinner parties, on the subway, at the doctor's office. Anybody who'll listen, I'll talk about Go. And inevitably, they ask me this question, what's the Rails for Go? And inevitably, I make the same exact face and a kind of a screeching noise. So let's talk about frameworks. Right? That's what everybody wants to know. What's this framework? It's a magical framework I can use to build my web applications in Go. Well, let's first discuss what we need from a framework. What are the things we're hoping to get? These are my things. These are the things that are important to me for the type of applications I build, right? Rendering, I want to be able to easily render HTML templates or JSON or XML. Well, maybe not so XML because I don't live in 2002 anymore. But HTML and JSON. I need good routing. I need to be able to get my requests to the right place in my application. Middleware is incredibly useful for things like database connections, session setups, session teardowns, authentication, and so on. Authentication. Be nice if people could log into their application. That'd be cool. Core support. I write a lot of back-end APIs and talk to them via JavaScript. So it's nice to be able to do that across domains because the API is maybe not necessarily sitting on www. Hot code reloading. That's a useful one. I hate to have to keep killing my app every single page load just to refresh it. Easy database access. There's nothing worse than complicated database access, PHP. Or Java, more so. So it's nice to be able to just quickly do things and get them in there. Maybe not necessarily a full-blown ORM like Active Record, but being able to access database is useful. And context sharing, being able to pass stuff from middleware to middleware to middleware to finally my handler. Maybe an auth token. You get an auth token, a piece of middleware. You validate that is an authorized user. And then maybe it's nice to pass that user along so that you have access to that user as you're going. So there are a bunch of frameworks out there that give you all these things. There's Gin, for example. Gin is it's apparently the fastest full-featured web framework for Go, crystal clear. according to their website. Their biggest claim to fame really appears to be how much faster they are than Martini, because this is their homepage and that's the big graph you see. But that is a full-featured framework for Go. There's Revel, which is a high productivity web framework for Go, which apparently also offers high performance, according to their website. And there's BGO. The nice thing about this one is that they are an open source framework to build and develop your application. So they're not high performance, or I guess, no, they're also high performance because they say it on their homepage. They all say it on their homepage. And then finally, there's Martini, which is kind of probably the leading framework. This one's classy web development in Go, by the way, in case you couldn't see that. And they all offer kind of, you know, a lot of the things that we talked about as being important in a framework. You know, great routing, they've got middleware, some have ORMs, like BGO has an ORM, but Martini doesn't. So some you have to kind of bring a few pieces to it. You know, they all offer rendering and stuff like that. And they're all fully kind of big, and they have everything. Kind of like I said, batteries included, as Martini says. But before I talk about these frameworks just a little bit more, I want to talk a little bit about Martini, which I said was probably the leading framework out there. Martini kind of took the Go web frameworks kind of space by storm when Jeremy first put it out. It was put up by Jeremy Saenz, also known as Code Gangsta, if you know him. Awesome dude, about as gangster as a Twinkie, but totally cool dude. Love him. And he put it out there, and he got a lot of criticism from the Go community. A lot of kind of younger Gophers like myself, and I say younger, I mean in terms of experience with Go, obviously not in age, kind of were like, oh, this is awesome, this is so cool, it's really nice. And then, you know, a lot of people with a bit more experience were like going, whoa, this is just awful. It's not idiomatic. You're using all this reflection. Like, it's slow. It's kind of overbearing. There's a lot kind of going on here. And to Jeremy's credit, he internalized all that, took that, and then wrote this great blog post called My Thoughts on Martini, where he says, you know what, you're right. It is not idiomatic. Its reflection is flawed. It does have a lot of issues. It's not the right way to build web applications. And so he suggested to people, you know, don't use it. You know, and I know Jeremy is no longer using it. It's being maintained. It's still very, very popular and has a great community around it. But he's not using it anymore because it's not the right way to go. So which way should you go? You know, which of these frameworks should you spend time to learn and investigate? You know, which one is the Rails for Go? Which one is the winner? And I would argue the answer is none of the above. It's none of them. They're not the Go way. That's not what Go is all about. Go is about simplicity, right? And I read a great quote the other day that someone said, you know, Go is a very simple language, and isn't it nice to have a language where that's actually the goal, right? Is to be simple, right? All these languages focus on complexity, and Go is the exact opposite, it's focusing on simplicity. So why would you want kind of complexity around your frameworks and building your web application, right? I just need to do these 8 things. And sometimes I don't even need to do these 8 things. Sometimes I only need 2 or 3 of them. You know, sometimes I don't need middleware. Sometimes I don't need rendering. Sometimes I don't need authentication. I might just need basic routing and some easy database access. Boom, right? I just need these things that are important to me in my application. And I also want to have a choice in the things that I use. You know, maybe in some cases I want to use one router because it offers a lot more flexibility, but maybe it's a bit slower. In other cases, performance is incredibly important, and I want something that maybe doesn't have as much flexibility, but is a lot faster. Right? And with these frameworks, you take convention over configuration. You get it all. You get the kitchen sink whether you want it or not. So where does that leave us? How do we get these things if we're not using one of these big frameworks? The answer is packages. Lots and lots of packages. No, I'm kidding you. It's not lots of packages because as Gophers, we know we don't use a lot of packages, right? We only try to pull in as few dependencies as possible. And I'm going to show you about 8 packages that meet these criteria that I think are kind of best of breed packages to do these things. And kind of armed with the URLs that I'm going to put in here for these packages, you can take these things away and build your web applications. And they're going to be lean, they're going to be fast, they're going to be clean. The package dependencies you're going to have like 1 or 2 files in them. There's not these complex masses of files that you get with like a BGO or something like that, where there's all these packages and all these files. There's not crazy reflection going on and kind of meta programming that's not common in Go. You're going to very easily, if there's a bug, you can find it, you can see it, you can easily submit a pull request for it, and it'll probably get pulled in very quickly. So let's start talking about these packages. My first package that I want to talk about is the PAT router. I love the PAT router. It's so simple, but really flexible. It gives you a lot of kind of said flexibility here. Here's kind of an example of what that looks like. I can map different verbs to endpoints and to handlers, and it works with standard HTTP handlers. So the response and request kind of pattern that you're used to if you've done any sort of programming before in Go. It also does really nice things like named parameters. So for example, where you see /article/category, categories in curly braces, that becomes a parameter available to you in the query parameters inside of your handler. So you can do /article/1, for example, and you're going to get that back. You're going to get the 1 back as a parameter. You can also do regular expression named parameters. So the one above that, where the ID has to be a number between, has to be a number, right? So you get that as a parameter. So it's got some really nice stuff. You can see it works with regular HTTP handle. It's a nice router. It's fast. It's simple. The source code is easy to read. If you want a really, really fast router, I would recommend the HTTP router. The downside with that is it doesn't work with standard handler funcs. You have to kind of wrap them because it has a third argument. And it does that because it creates zero garbage, and that's the easiest way to create zero garbage, is to pass that third argument of parameters in. So it is a great router, HTTP router. Highly recommended if you need bare metal performance, like just stupid fast. But if you want ease of use and compatibility, I honestly think PAT is a great way to go. And it's part of the Gorilla package. We'll talk a little bit about Gorilla stuff later. But it sits on top of the MUX router, which is even more powerful, but kind of a bit more complex to use. I like the simplicity of what PAT offers. Negroni. I think this is a great framework. This is a great piece of code, also written by Code Gangsta by Jeremy Saenz, who did Martini. And this is just a way of handling middleware. So that's all it does. It works with all the kind of standard HTTP handler funcs. Here I've got a PAT router, and I'm going to create a new Negroni, and I say I want to use middlewares 1, 2, and 3, and I want you to use the router in there. I want you to kind of wrap the router. So the way a request will come in, the request comes in, it'll go to middleware 1, middleware 2, middleware 3, and then finally to PAT, where PAT's going to route it to the correct handler, in this case, a home handler. Really easy to use interface, simple, very nice. It also comes with what with Jeremy calls a classic, Negroni Classic, and that is like 3 different handlers, 3 different pieces of middleware: a logging middleware, a panic recovery middleware, and a static file server middleware that just serve things out of the public directory. But they're also great places to look at how to write middleware for Negroni. It's incredibly easy. I use this in pretty much all of my projects, Negroni. The next thing, also by Jeremy. Jeremy is just a force to be reckoned with in the web space for Go, is Gin, not to be confused with the Gin web framework. This is just a simple binary that lets you do live code reloading for Go applications, for web applications. It's very simple. You say, hey, here, Gin, I want you to run on this port, and I want you to proxy things to my application on this port. And then what Gin will basically do, and I'm oversimplifying here, but basically a request will come in, it'll kill the Go process, start another one up, proxy it on. So that way, every single time you hit your Go app, it's reloading your code for you and getting the latest and greatest. Obviously, do not run this in production. You'd be surprised how many times I have to say things like don't run this in production because it does kill your app every single time. It is only meant for development use, but it is a life-saving tool. I can't tell you how much nicer life is running my Go applications using Gym in development. Render by Unrolled. This is a great piece of a package here for rendering data on HTTP apps here. You can see it's got all sorts of different functions here: write, data, JSON, XML, HTML. The really nice thing about all these things is it'll set like all the appropriate headers and response types and flags for you. So when you do, say, render JSON here, it's going to render that JSON with the 200 status, because that's what we're set here. But it's also going to set the content type to application JSON, all that sort of stuff. So we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to create new encoders and all that sort of stuff. We could just kind of pass it the interface that we have, and it's going to render it. There's also nice configuration settings for it, so we can do things like tell it to indent the JSON and XML in kind of a pretty format, or not, so if you don't want that. So it's a great in development mode to have it nicely formatted out so you can see what's going on. Things like when it comes to like rendering HTML, this is where it gets really nice, because you can just give it the name of a template, and it'll go to the templates directory, it'll find that template, it'll read it in if it hasn't already. It'll cache it, obviously. It then does all the template stuff you usually do in Go, where you find the template, you compile the template, then you execute the template, and then you can print the template out, send the template down on your response. This takes care of all that for you. And of course, it's configurable. It has all sorts of different configurations, which folder you want the templates in, file extensions, all this sort of stuff. But to reduce all of that template code down to that one, HTML, call is amazing. It's so nice to use when you're writing web apps like that. I honestly love this package. I think it's great. The SQLX package. This we were at a panel last week. Jeremy Saenz, myself, and Bill Kennedy actually, and Palo Alto. And someone asked what our favorite packages were, and this was, I think, my top choice was the SQLX package. The SQLX package is really a superset that sits on top of the standard library SQL package, and I'd say Jim did a great job of mapping kind of one-to-one the SQL package to SQLX. So you can do all the same things that you can do with the SQL package, but then there's also all these kind of really nice features you put on top of it. It's not an ORM, and I can't stress that enough. It is not about being an ORM. It is purely a way of making accessing SQL databases easier. So for example here, I've got these two queries. The first one is an insert. And we're saying, insert into person, first name, last name, email. The values are first name, last name, email. And then when I go to execute it, I'm giving the query string, and then I'm giving it a struct here, pointing to a struct that has the values I want in it. And named exec is going to strip off those values from that person and insert them into the query statement where they need to go for me. I don't need to do that kind of manually. It's going to take care of all that for me, which is really beautiful. And then the next one I think is even more beautiful, where I've got a people array of persons, terrible example for names, and then when I select, I'm doing a select star for person, it's going to populate that person array with all the records from the database. It's going to make sure that it's going to create a person struct for each one, and it's going to fill it appropriately and return it back. So I don't have to do scans anymore of every row record that comes back and then mapping all the columns myself. This is going to do it for me. And that's just really, really nice to have. And you use some struct tagging to make that possible. So you can map column names to your struct names a little nicer. You can also use things like a dash to say, don't map this to the database. It just really cleans up so much code. Yeah, you still have the SQL statements in your code, but personally I'm fine with that. Make them constants, and then you just kind of reference them wherever you need them. So it's not an ORM, it's just easy database access. And isn't that what we all really want at the end of the day? I always joke about in Rails, I'll spend 20 or 30 minutes in Navicat creating this beautiful SQL query to do the thing I want, and then I'll spend an hour and a half trying to translate that into Active Record, into the proper syntax in Active Record. It's so frustrating sometimes because you just really want to just do, you know, a call by SQL, but you can't because Active Record is kind of a pain in the tuchus when you do that. But anyway, SQLX, can't recommend it enough. CORS support, great little package by Fasterness called CORS here, and it's very simple. You can see I've got a PAT router, I've got Negroni going, and then I'm going to create a new CORS here, and that's going to let me set, you know, the options. It's going to handle the options when that comes in as a request. It's going to handle that for us. It's going to handle, you know, which methods are allowed, and obviously by default it's all methods. We can obviously configure it, say no, I just want gets or posts or gets and posts or no puts, whatever. It also allows origins. By default it's all origins, but we can lock that down. We can do things like allow headers and expose headers. So here I'm allowing the X authorization header to come into my application, otherwise it's going to get filtered out. And the same thing with expose header. I'm exposing X pagination when it goes back out of my application, otherwise it'll get stopped there at the door. And the way this is set up here, the way in this example, request is going to come in, it's going to go to CORS first, then it's going to go to Negroni, run through the middlewares, then it's going to go to PAT, and then PAT's going to finally send it to wherever I need to go. The really nice thing about all this stuff, it all works together because it all works in these kind of standard handler funcs. And that's really important when you're looking at packages around your web stuff. Make sure it all works together. Make sure it interplays nicely. And if they conform to the standard handler interface, you're going to be fine here. So Goth, this is a little shameless plug here. It's a little package I wrote. I ran into an issue for a client last year where we wanted to do OAuth type authentication through third parties, so Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. And there was no good packages out there that did that. There were a few that did that. I found one called GomniAuth, and I said, oh, I'm going to use this. And I wanted to use Twitter, but there was no Twitter support, so I said, well, I'll add it. And I found two things were wrong with it. First, it was very much so not idiomatic code. And the second problem was it was hard-coded around OAuth 2, and Twitter is OAuth. So I was very frustrated and annoyed, and I thought, you know, there's no reason why we have to be so focused on OAuth 2, and we can't just write a nice API that lets us do authentication through whatever service we happen to want to use. So that's where Goth came in. So here is a basic example of Goth. It's very simple. I've created some new Goth providers, in this case Twitter and Facebook. I'm going to jump down to the bottom of the example here and say that, you know, the first we create an endpoint called /auth/provider, so /auth/Facebook/auth/Twitter, and then we're going to use the Gothic package and use the begin auth handler there. Gothic is just a sub package of Goth, which its whole goal is to just wrap up kind of the average use case of using Goth. If you really want to go through all the steps, feel free to use all the Goth, use the Goth API. If you just want something simple, use Gothic. That sits on top of all that. So the Gothic begin auth handler will create the sessions needed, keep track of everything for you. It'll generate the correct URLs, and then it'll redirect the user over to Facebook, where they'll do their thing on Facebook, and it'll come back and it'll get mapped to the top mapping here, just the callback, where we're going to use the Gothic complete user auth function, which will then complete the authorization process, and it's going to return back a user that's going to have things like their name, their email address if possible, the UUID of the user, the provider, also all the image, a profile image, that sort of stuff that we get back from all these providers. It's been great. We've got a lot of people submitting all sorts of authentications, so we now have Facebook, GitHub, Google+, Last.fm, LinkedIn, Spotify, and Twitter. So if the service you use isn't on that list, please go to GitHub and add it. Love to have it. GitHub.com/markbates/goth. But what I'm showing you here on the screen is essentially a working example. This code will actually work, assuming you plug in the correct Twitter keys, keys and secrets. So recommend that. For context, I think we're almost near the end here, actually. The Gorilla Context package. So again, just to give some context to context, if you will. We want to, we have something in the middleware. Maybe we have, say, an auth token that came in. We want to authenticate against the database. We get back a user, an authenticated user. We don't want to just throw that away when we pass it on to the next middleware. We want to hold on to that so that subsequent middlewares or the handler at the end can use that user we've already done the work to find. And that's where your Gorilla context comes in. And the way it works is pretty simple. You use the context, you use the request as the key, and then you give it kind of a key value pair after that you want to set. And then to get back the value, you just say context get, give it the request and the name of the value you want. In this case, give me back foo, and it's going to return bar. I can also do get OK, and that's going to give me a kind of a true false OK flag. One thing I will say about this is very important. This is a very easy way. If you're looking for a way to create a memory leak in your Go web application, context is the way to do it. It is so easy. If you find a memory leak, chances are it's because of context. So what happens is I said you're using the request as the key, and the way context works is it basically has a huge map with requests as the key to that map, and then it's got kind of its own little store inside of it where it's storing things like foo. And so what you need to do is you need to clean up that map. There is a clear function you can call. Matter of fact, they even give you a handler, so you can just wrap your handler around your application, using a piece of middleware, and that'll clean it up for you. But you must clean it up. You want to make sure you remove that request key from your from that map. Otherwise, it's just going to sit there collecting requests. The garbage collector is never going to give them away because they're sitting inside of a map and it might be used. So please, like I said, unless that's the whole go, unless you're just like, screw this, I really want a memory leak in production, let's use context without cleaning it up, then cool, man. But if you really want a memory leak in production, might I recommend Ruby. It's great at that, particularly Rails. Rails is awesome at creating memory leaks. So that's it. Actually, we talked a couple things about the Gorilla Toolkit. Everything by the Gorilla Toolkit is pretty awesome. So check it out. They've got a lot of packages that do a lot of great things for web applications, things like sessions and web sockets, all sorts of really nice stuff for binding forms to structs, that sort of a thing. Lots of really nice stuff in there. Pull in what you need, but only pull it in when you need it. That's what's really nice about this approach. We've talked about. I've never talked about sessions because I typically, honestly, don't use sessions a lot because I write a lot of APIs, and those are usually sessionless. So I don't need to pull in any sort of session soft, any sort of a session package. But if I do, I get it from the Gorilla Toolkit. So, final thoughts. I know this is a lot of stuff I'm throwing at you here. It's overwhelming, I know. Thankfully, we have a little video. You guys can go back and look at all this stuff and make fun of my Boston accent all you want. Because it's wicked pissa, dude. I said that these are the things I needed. I needed rendering, I needed routing, middleware, authentication, cores, hot code reloading, easy database access, and context sharing. And I was able to get all those things with packages. And these packages, like I said, are 1, maybe 2 files deep. They're not big packages. They're very simple, very easy to read, well-tested packages you can pull in when you need them. And feel free, like I said, if you need a faster router, use a faster router. Switch it out. You're in control. You know what code is in your application. With all these frameworks, you don't know what they're bringing in. You have no idea what packages they're depending on, relying on, and what code they're bringing in, because you're just kind of blindly accepting that. Here, you are in control. You know what you're getting. So who needs a framework? I don't think I do. That's it. Follow me, Mark Bates, on the Twitters and Metacast.com for your weekly go. Thank you very much.
Hey, Mark, that was great. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me, Bill. I appreciate it.
Hey, switch back over to your view. Put your pants back on.
I have to put pants on now?
Yeah, please.
No one told me how to put pants on.
We've got enough videos of you flying around the internet without pants on, so we don't need another one. In bathrobes.
I am wearing my 3 Seashells t-shirt, though, so if anybody has questions about how the 3 Seashells work, feel free and ask.
So does anyone have questions for Mark at all? Mark has a lot of experience building these web APIs out and using these packages, so if you're building your own APIs right now, if you have any questions. This would be a great time.
Okay, we got one. You got one. How do you usually handle authorization? Now we have authentication, which is one part, but then there's the other half, authorization, which is who's allowed to do what. Get any?
How do I handle
Yeah, the question is, how do you handle authorization as opposed to just authentication? Who's allowed to do what?
Right, that's a great question. So I've kind of typically rolled my own. I've thought about trying to figure out a way to open source what I've done, but it's so dependent on the things that you're looking at and the things you're trying to do. I've kind of modeled what I usually do off of, there's a Ruby gem called Pundit that I like a lot. And so I typically have kind of a policy associated with each type of object. And I go and create a new permissions, and I pass in the objects, the current user and the object. I keep saying object. I'm sorry, it's not the value, the struct, whatever it is you want to talk about, the thing you want to authorize against, right? And I need a good word for that type of a thing. And so I usually pass those things in, and then I do honestly just do a bit of type checking to figure out which policy to run, and then I launch that policy, and that policy will tell me whether I can read, create, update, that sort of thing. It's a pretty simplistic approach, but it works really well. Another thing, on top of that, I also tend to take and put that as part of on all my structs. For example, I'll have a permissions entry, so that the permissions attributes, so that when I do get that permissions back, that I've kind of run that policy and I know what the person can and cannot do, I add that onto the struct that I'm about to then serialize to JSON. So when it goes down the pipe, all the permissions for that user are on that JSON object. So then in my clients, in my JavaScript, I can say, oh, I've got this, to do, and off that I can do to-do.permissions.create or to-do.permissions.destroy. So maybe, use that to decide whether the person can just put the destroy button on the page in my JavaScript, for example. But it's, I've, like I said, trying to think about a great way to kind of open source that, and I haven't found a good way that was clean and nice yet. But that's typically the approach I take.
All right, thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
You had a question? Oh, you look like you were there. All right. Anybody else have a question for Mark?
No one wants to know why I was deported? Okay, that's fine.
The fact that you made it into Boston is, I think, good enough for everybody.
Ironically, my wife and I have both been deported from each other's countries, so that's kind of an interesting story unto itself. But these
are okay. If you go to GopherCon and we find Mark, these are stories you want to ask over a pitcher of beer, and just you're gonna crack up for like a good half an hour. Mark, well, I really appreciate you taking the time. That was excellent. You did an excellent job. Got this video now for the rest of the community to see. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
All right, good night. We'll talk later.
Okay, bye.
All right, so we're going to set up